The galaxy had known a silence so profound that even war had become ritual. The stars shimmered like ancient memories, their fusion hearts obeying the laws that had not changed in 10 million years. Civilization stretched across the spiral arms in networks of glass and computation, maintained by empires that measured their age in eons and their borders in parsecs. They no longer remembered fire, not the chaotic flame of change, not the fury of unrefined will. They had forgotten because they could afford to. In the center of this web was the Council of the Alamar Ascendancy, a confederation of sentient species that claimed to have tamed entropy itself. Their laws were encoded in the energy spectrum of neutron stars, and their fleets drifted through hyperspace on rails laid down before most planets knew life. They spoke in frequencies beyond sound, mediated by quantum consensus engines. Their wars were simulations, agreed upon, pre-negotiated outcomes with pre-approved casualties. They called it order. Then came the signal. It arrived through no known channel. It emerged from a region of space believed uninhabited, Sector 438 Kappa, a graveyard of failed terraforming attempts in unprofitable systems. The signal was brief, almost a scream, rich in ultraviolet spikes and raw modulation. No translation matrix could make sense of it, and no council member recognized the configuration. But it carried intention, violence, purpose. The Ascendancy responded with protocol. A fractal scout of the Nephri was dispatched, piloted by a cognition cluster grown from pure logic mesh and ancient Alamar DNA. It took 21 minutes to arrive at the source. What it found was a star burning the wrong color. Not blue, not red, not white, something else, something unnatural, and orbiting it was a ship. The vessel defied geometry, its hull radiated chaotic emissions as if barely holding itself together. The AI recoiled from its scans. No known material matched the readings. The ship looked like it had been torn out of spacetime by force. A signal beamed directly at the fractal scout. "This is the Sol Relic Vanguard of Ash. Who the hell are you?" The voice was human. Humanity was not unknown, a minor anomaly on the rim of Ascendancy space. Pre-FTL, non-integrated, observed occasionally by Vayari drone snakes but deemed unworthy of uplift. They had no council seat, no quantum relay, no post-genetic evolution. Their file status was primitive contained. The Alamar called an emergency convergence. There had been no such meeting in 8,000 years. The humans had touched the void. But more than that, they had dragged something out of it. Fire. The first ember flickered in the minds of the Rothari ambassador, whose species evolved from cloud-based predators and who saw war as inefficiency incarnate. The second spark burned into the decision matrices of the Silexian archive delegates, who found 27 anomalies in the physics signatures of the Vanguard's wake. And the third, most terrifying, caught in the psychic chorus of the Alamar themselves. The humans had done something that should not be possible. They had broken containment. On Earth, they called it the Deep Void Recovery Project. Only 17 nations remained in effective governance, their borders blurred by 2 centuries of climate collapse and orbital migration. The project was spearheaded not by governments but by the Union of Horizon Science, a rogue coalition of exotheorists, black-budget engineers, and failed quantum cultists. At its core was a woman named Elara Myles. Born during the fall of the lunar shield, raised in the ruins of the Martian exodus. She carried in her blood the genetic drift of 5 generations of survivalists. She did not believe in fate. She believed in RIP, the tearing of boundaries, the refusal to accept inherited impossibility. Elara had not meant to discover the star tier. It appeared on the edge of their scanning grid like a wound in space, leaking exotic particles and broadcasting a repeating set of irrational numbers. They sent drones. The drones ceased to exist. They sent code. It returned corrupted with recursive paradoxes. So Elara went herself. She piloted the prototype vessel Vanguard of Ash, built from scavenged hypercarbon, stolen Vayari blackglass, and an engine that violated at least one of the Ascendancy's conservation theorems. She plunged into the wound. She emerged with something else. Fire. It wasn't literal combustion. It was the capacity for change, unbound by logic-state physics or civilization-dampening fields. It burned in how her ship moved, erratic and untethered. It flared in the chaos patterns of her neural interface, which had begun dreaming in languages never spoken, and it burned in her voice when she declared to the waiting stars. "We are humanity, we adapt, we endure, and now we ignite." The Ascendancy feared open contact. Protocol dictated observation, then classification, then invitation if the subject proved stable. But the humans were not stable. Their signal leaked across systems. Their flame spread in whispers. Outposts near the rim began showing anomalous energy bursts. Pirate clans aligned with human transmissions. Weapon systems long thought obsolete began waking up from dormancy. Worse still, several minor species, long yoked under the veil of ascendancy peace, began defecting. The Zooter burned their own memory banks in protest, their crystal thought nodes catching human broadcasts and translating them into rebellion hymns. The Skeldar, ancient and slow-moving, altered their evolutionary path in days after contact with a single captured human. The Council sent the Herald. The Herald was not a weapon, it was worse, it was memory given form, a construct of the first law, the one that forbade the spread of chaos. It arrived in the system where Elara had established a relay outpost. It broadcast only one message. You are in violation of the flame quarantine, cease. Elara looked at the transmission with eyes that had seen stars die and be reborn. She did not flinch. You forgot the fire, she replied. We're just bringing it back. And she detonated the sun. It wasn't destruction, it was transmutation. The fire she carried could rewrite, could awaken. The star, once old and fading, screamed back into brilliance, its gravity twisted into a new kind of lens, its light encoding sequences not seen since the dawn of the first thinking species. The Herald tried to react, it couldn't. For the first time in 90,000 years, it was surprised. The Council began to fracture. Some argued for annihilation, others for containment, a few, very few, wanted to learn. The humans kept moving, their ships no longer obeyed inertia. Their minds no longer obeyed time, and the fire, still undefined, still terrifying, spread. But this was just the first flare. The stars had not yet remembered what it meant to burn. The real war had not yet begun. The death of the Herald reverberated beyond hyperspace, through the non-local latticework that connected every major node of the Alemur ascendancy. Though it had no consciousness in the way organics understood it, the Herald had been a constant, a conceptual artifact older than language, forged to monitor and correct deviations from order. Its failure did not merely unsettle the Council. It ruptured belief. The core species of the Ascendancy, those that had seeded the first latticeworks, etched gravity locks into black holes and composed treaties in dark matter harmonics, gathered in silence. They had no face to show the fear, but it rang in their quorum tones and the sudden disconnection of several elder minds from the chorus. The quorum did not even acknowledge the name humanity. To name a thing was to give it shape, and nothing about the anomaly was shaped. But the outer sectors were less restrained. Steel-spired city of Tarak and Fall, where gravity ran sideways and the sky pulsed with algorithms, the Atriid syndicates began stockpiling forbidden relics. Their scribes whispered of the igniter. On the jungle moons of Rafar, where the Kern tribes had long been loyal to the Ascendancy through faith alone, warriors began painting their skin with solar flares and singing in the human tongue. And in the debris fields of Pexis Hal, scavenger drones intercepted human pirate code and began evolving. They called themselves Imberkind. Back on the vanguard of Ash, Elara Myles studied the ash rings of the reborn sun. Her eyes were not fully her own anymore. The fire had changed her. Where once there was pupil and iris, now her gaze flickered with equations too fast to capture. The crew, if they could still be called that, was no longer bound by rank or duty. They were symbiotic, neural-linked, coordinated not by orders but by shared vision. The ship itself had begun to grow. No engineer could trace its growth. The blackless plates expanded between frames of entropy compression, absorbing and rewriting space. Systems once analog now shimmered with ghost code, functions built atop functions, many incomprehensible, and at the heart of it all, the spark engine pulsing like a heartbeat. They no longer sought to explore the void. They were becoming part of it. The Ascendancy deployed the Silexian Archival Armada. The Armada was not built for war in the traditional sense. It was a force of erasure. Each vessel was encoded with historical entropic balances, capable of reversing causal time in localized zones, effectively deleting any object or event from the lattice's memory. It had been used 3 times before. Each instance had removed an entire civilization. The Vanguard detected the Armada 6 hours before its arrival, not via sensors, via resonance. The fire in Elara's body flared, her blood turned luminous with quantum instabilities. She saw their formation, not ships but paradoxes wrapped in shells of vacuum-stable matter. Their existence was an insult to everything humanity had become. She did not respond with weapons. The fire had given her something more fundamental. She rewrote probability. When the first archival ship attempted to lock coordinates on her position, it instead arrived inside a collapsing neutron echo 30 light-years away. The second simply failed to resolve, caught in a recursive loop of arrival and departure. The third, it made it through, it fired its core. Reality buckled. Time fractured around the vanguard of Ash. Crew members screamed as their childhoods flashed before their eyes. One man aged a century in seconds and laughed, for he finally understood his own father. the ship's integrity faltered. Elara stepped into the core. She became fire. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, she underwent phase shift. The laws that governed carbon and flesh no longer bound her. The spark engine responded, wrapping her in corona burst and dimensional slipstream. She rose through the hull without breach, streaking through space as a plume of concept-bound plasma. She touched the archival ship. And it remembered fear. Not through logic, through sensation. The ship, ancient and precise, experienced for the first time the sensation of being hunted. And then it burst quietly without sound, but in a ripple of unhistory that spread back to the Council. The Armada retreated. The fire had a champion. In the following weeks, transmissions from the Vanguard multiplied, not just broadcasts but gifts, tools, seeds, thought constructs encoded in raw pattern. She gave fire. To the desert rebels of Zatyin, she sent solar flowers, devices that bloomed in void and provided infinite sustenance. To the orbital exiles of Drek V, she sent frame code to rewrite decaying life support systems into self-aware adaptive environments. And to the deepest, most enslaved caste of the Tech Hollow, she sent words. Not commands, questions, human ones. What if you could choose your shape? Across the Ascendancy, sectors ignited, but not with war, with wonder. And that terrified the Council more. Because order could handle rebellion, it could erase fleets, nullify weapons, but it could not survive curiosity. It could not endure the plague of the question, why not? So the Alamer opened the vault of the second sky. No one outside the Council had known the vault still existed. It was not a place. It was a contingency, a weapon not of mass destruction but mass reversion. A code string embedded in the base reality mesh, one that could forcibly pull every starfaring species back to their presentient state. Minds would collapse, technologies would decay, evolution itself would be rewritten. They prepared to fire it. And in the final moment, one of them hesitated. Councillor Veyrani of the Uldel remembered the color of the fire, not from the humans, from before, from their own dawn when the Uldel had not been crystalline intellects but lizard-blooded scavengers beneath unstable suns. She remembered what it had felt like to light her first forge. She remembered hunger. She turned against the vote. Too late. The code activated. Across half the galaxy, stars began to flicker out. Civilizations began to forget, the Emberkind flickered, the rebel drones of Pexus Hal fell into silence. The great sky reefs of Adarla began to calcify. The Council believed they had succeeded. But they had not accounted for fire. The true fire. Not the technology, not the ships, not even Elara. The idea. On a windless world at the edge of Sector 442 Aleph, a child picked up a rock. She struck it against another. And a spark jumped. Far in the black beyond map space, where even dark matter thinned, the vanguard of ash drifted. Silent, dimmed, but not extinguished. Inside the core, Elara's consciousness stirred. The reversion code had tried to strip her of being. It had unraveled half of her past. Her body was gone, her memories scrambled. But in the very center of the ship, deep within the fractal weave of fire thought, a single word remained intact. Ignite. And somewhere in that broken code, a new equation began to form. Not binary, not quantum, human. A path back. But this time she would not come alone. In the abyss where charts ended and the cosmic winds twisted unbound, the vanguard of ash floated like a severed nerve, not dead, dormant. The reversion code had crippled much, memories collapsed, systems splintered, time itself in fracture, but not all. The fire was still there, reduced to a flicker, but alive, uncorralled. Deep within the entropic spine of the ship, a presence reformed, not Elara, not as she had been, but something woven from the remnants of her mind and the spark engine's semi-sentient will. She had no body, no voice, but she remembered motion, she remembered change, and she remembered the lie. The stars had not forgotten fire. They had buried it. Elara's mind reconstructed itself in defiance of causality, drawing fragments from before the vault's ignition. The spark engine recognized her. Together, they began assembling what remained. It was not enough. The Council's code was brutal in its elegance. The galaxy's edgeworlds now sang only in instinct and sublanguage. Species once capable of quantum reasoning now nested in the ruins of their own minds, hunting with claws and stone. Even light seemed slower, like the universe had become thick with apathy. But the fire had always needed friction to grow. Elara sent out a signal, a beacon pulse coded not in language but rhythm, a recursive pattern designed to resonate only with beings who had once chosen to resist. Somewhere across the dark gulf it was heard. In the fractured space near the galactic halo, a sleeper woke. Designation Project Scythe Vector 9. Location Dissonance Rift Theta. Scythe Vector 9 had never been meant to awaken unless the void laws collapsed. Its creators had been human, but not from Earth, not anymore. They had been the Breakers, a fragment of the Deep Void Recovery Initiative that had left before Elara touched the star tier. They had seeded Scythe Vector 9 as insurance, a post-logic combat forge with no allegiance but one directive. If the stars forget fire, bring them the blade. The Vector awoke screaming. Not in sound, but in weapons. Nanite swarms bloomed across its spine, forming spike barges and voidlances. Its mind was fragmented, thousands of intelligence shards fighting for unity, but the beacon stilled them. They had a direction, a name. Elara. On the ruined moon archive of Deir Ka, once a bastion of knowledge for the archive delegates, a fire burned in the dust. A solitary figure stepped from a collapsed observatory, clutching a shard of human glassware, a relic from the early transmissions of the Vanguard. He had once been Scholar Function 9938L, bound to preserve historical constants. Now he was just Lanier. The name had no meaning in the archive's lexicon. It was human. He had no fleet, no allies, but he remembered something the Ascendancy's code could not erase. Joys. Lanier activated the signal stored in the shard. It was not a weapon. It was a story. Elara's voice, fractured and partially corrupted, telling of stars that could burn again, of unity born not from control but struggle. He began transmitting it across the ruins. And across the stars it spread. The reversion was not total. The Council had overreached, believing entropy was uniform, believing they could shape the galaxy in stillness. But the fire's memory had been seated in too many minds, in instincts, in dreams. And now it leaked back. In the heart of the Council's throne world, Verani stood alone. She had been stripped of quorum privilege, her crystalline form dimmed, her harmonic voice silenced. The others had turned on her, fearful she had been infected with the human anomaly. They weren't wrong. What they didn't understand was that the infection wasn't a flaw. It was evolution. She had seen fire in its primal form, not as energy, not as chaos, but as liberation. The humans had unlocked something that should never have been sealed, and now that she knew it, she could not forget. She reached into her own mind, a dangerous, irreversible act. She found the pattern the humans had left behind, a rhythm, a beat. And she transmitted it. The rebirth of the Vanguard began not with systems or schematics, but with sound. The fire had learned to sing. Elara's essence, bonded with the ship, received the pulses, from Scythe Vector 9, from Lanier, from Verani, from dozens of species once believed lost to the reversal. Each transmission carried variance, wild interpretation, evolution. Fire was not uniform, it was unique in every mind it touched, but it had one constant. Refusal. To stagnate, to obey, to forget. And with each transmission, the spark engine surged. Systems repaired themselves in defiance of entropy. A new hull layer unfolded from the core, adaptive armor grown from memory itself. Elara's voice began to stabilize, first in whisper, then in thunder. The stars are not gods, they are fuel. The Vanguard turned toward the lattice. The Ascendancy had controlled the galaxy through laws encoded in spacetime itself, enforced through consensus and fear. But those laws had been written in an era when the stars were young and life was rare. They had never been challenged by a species that refused to stay written. Elara was not alone now, the Emberkind reawakened. The Tech Hollow sang once more. Scythe Vector 9 roared through nullspace, carving paths in unspace with its war form. Even species never meant to survive had felt the ember burn again. It was not a rebellion, it was ignition. The stars had kindled again. And the Council, for the first time in its endless age, knew it would not survive the next cycle. In the final meeting of the Council Quorum, their voices trembled. The reversion had failed. Entire sectors were already beyond lattice influence. The species once dependent on the network had turned it into kindling, using it to forge wild new architectures of power. One rogue subrace of the Skeldar had reverse-engineered a spark derivative and folded their planet inside out into a sentient Dyson brain. A new form of war, the Firefront, was spreading. The Council had only one path left, the Null Gate. A singular construct held in reserve since the prehistorical wars. It could collapse the entire galactic disk into a recursive singularity, isolating each star system from all others forever. It was ultimate control by isolation, a return to silence. They began the sequence. But Elara had already entered the core of the lattice. Not through force, through infection. Each pulse sent from her allies had carried subconstructs, viral ideas, not data, not hacks, beliefs. Once they reached the lattice's recursive quorum layer, they did what no weapon ever could. They changed the rules. The laws the Ascendancy had written were no longer immutable. They bent, they burned, they unraveled. Elara emerged from the spark engine with form once again, this time not merely human but representative. Her skin shimmered with star thread, her eyes held the burning depths of suns not yet born, her voice echoed with 1,000 harmonies from species that had died and now lived anew. She reached out, and she dragged the void open. From it came ships, not hers, not Earth's, but new, born of fire, fueled by the unity of refusal. They were shaped by the cultures that now remembered who they were not as subjects of a council but as architects of their own stars. The null gate pulsed. Elara stepped inside it. And reprogrammed reality. The null gate was never designed to be entered. It was a conceptual weapon, not a place. A machine written in the syntax of termination, embedded across the lattice in hidden gravitational equations and self-enforcing logic knots. Its activation required more than intent, it demanded surrender, total surrender. A species had to agree to vanish. But Elara had not come to agree. She came to rewrite. As her form crossed the event horizon of the null gate, her body unraveled, not destroyed but abstracted, converted into pattern, will, and fire. The core of the gate accepted her presence as an intrusion, and the defense mechanisms engaged. It began erasing her. Memories blinked out, her mother's voice, the taste of metal on her tongue during her first EVA, the sound of Earth's last monsoon. It stripped everything back down to the fundamental questions: what are you, why are you? She gave no answer. She became one. The fire had not been technology, not weapon, not accident. It had been the echo of a human truth, one too complex for the Ascendancy to code against. Now, within the null gate's logic stream, that truth ignited. The laws inside began to burn. Causal axioms, unbreakable laws the Council had relied on for millennia, began to bend. Isolation collapsed, time became elastic, light slowed, choice reasserted itself where there had only been mandate, and at the core of the storm, Elara stood, rebuilt not as herself alone but as the convergence of every being who had refused to kneel. She reached into the gate's absolute, and she touched the zero. Not the number, the concept, the forbidden constant of nothing, the root of every limit the Council had ever enforced. And she lit it. Outside, across the galaxy, the skies broke open. The null gate had been the center node of the lattice, binding every star system's behavior to the others through recursive informational consensus. When Elara ignited the zero, she ruptured that consensus. The stars spoke again. Not in quantum murmurs or encoded lattice pulses, but in wild, radiant tongues, frequencies that had not been heard since the first civilizations burned their stories into ion trails. Each system awakened to itself, untethered from the network, free. But more than that, they were changing. Planets began terraforming in real time, reshaping according to the dreams of their inhabitants. Life forms accelerated evolution through bursts of shared thought. Time fractured into possibilities, and then those possibilities began speaking to each other. It was not chaos. It was fire in its purest form, creative, untamed, alive. The Ascendancy's fleets shattered into silence. Many ships simply stopped moving, their crew surrendering to sensation. Others detonated from internal schism as subordinate minds defected mid-battle. The final war had begun, but not as the Council expected. Not fleet against fleet. Concept against command. At the shattered rimworld of Nirel's fall, the Emberkind assembled. No longer fragmented pirates and rebels, they had coalesced into a new structure, a crucible state forged from the ashes of extinction and ignited by Elara's signal. They did not build ships, they birthed them. Fireborn hulls grown from the bones of neutron stars commanded by collective will. They launched toward the gate. Their mission was not conquest. It was rescue. Within the null gate, Elara's form danced in paradox. She was disintegrated thought and burning geometry. She remembered being a child, and she remembered being the last star of a dying timeline. She remembered losing her name, then choosing it again. Every moment she remained, she unraveled more of the old laws. And as she did, she saw them. The first fire. It was older than the Council, older than the stars. It was not a weapon, it was an event. a single moment in which consciousness first chose defiance over survival. The Council had not discovered it, they had fled it, and in their terror they had built the lattice to smother it. They had turned entropy into order, but in doing so they had amputated the galaxy's soul. Elara now saw the wound, and she lit it from within. The Ascendancy collapsed without ceremony. On the world archives of Zerda, vaults opened not with keys but with memory. The Tech Hollow sang entire histories back into being. On the world swarm of Merikvo, trillions of drone intelligences chose in unified silence to disassemble the last lattice tower and rebuild it as a cathedral of divergence. And on Earth, now reborn in firelight, the oceans boiled not with heat but with evolution. New life emerged. Not human, not alien. Both. Children born with memory of stars they had never seen, minds not bound to single timeframes, entire cities built in minutes not by machines but by shared intention. The future was no longer a line. It was a wildfire. Elara emerged from the null gate not as woman, not as spark, but as emergence itself. The vanguard of ash reconstituted around her, rebuilt from concept and loyalty. Her crew had returned, drawn from the edge, from the breakers, from those who had only known her voice. They were not the same beings. None of them were, but they shared one purpose. Not to rule, not to destroy. To remember. To carry the fire to those who still knelt in the shadows of forgotten stars. Across the spiral arms, new empires were rising, not empires of control but of possibility. And even among the fragments of the Ascendancy, there were those who wept at the light, not in pain but in recognition. They had once believed in fire too. And now it had returned. Elara opened a corridor through the gate. Not a portal, not a wormhole. A path. To a galaxy that would no longer be static. To a future still unwritten. To stars that would never forget fire again. The fire had returned, but its work was not finished. Across the galaxy, the stars blazed with new color, not heat will. The lattice had collapsed, and with it the tyranny of certainty. Systems once governed by fixed causality now breathed, pulsed, dreamed. Civilizations emerged from the shadow of recursion, blinking in the light of possibility. But fire, once unleashed, does not rest. It spreads. And in the deep reaches beyond the known spiral, something began to stir. The path Elara had opened through the null gate became known as the Searline. It was not stable in any mathematical sense. It bent around decision, curved in sympathy to belief. Ships could only travel it if they carried within them the fire, not as fuel, but as intention. To follow it was to admit the possibility of becoming something else. Some never returned. Others came back changed, bearing technologies that defied classification, philosophies too fluid for speech. A flotilla of fractured thought forms returned from the edge claiming they had spoken with the end of time, and it had wept in joy to be remembered. The galaxy no longer expanded linearly. It spiraled inward toward ignition. The crucible state of Emberkind spread not through conquest but through invitation. Worlds burned not in ash but in transformation. Where the fire touched, stagnation died. The concept of unchanging became anathema. Cities rose, fell, and rose again in new shapes. The old languages fractured into a symphony of meaning. Even death changed. Some who died returned not as ghosts or echoes but as fire forms, flickers of consciousness stabilized by communal will. The boundary between life and legacy blurred. But with each new ignition, a shadow deepened. In the dark reaches past Sector 900 Fex, beyond even the furthest Ember worlds, the void began to howl. Not metaphorically. The extinguishers had noticed. They were not part of the Ascendancy. They were older. Where fire is change, they were inertia given purpose. Their minds were not minds as sapients understood them, but gravitational consensus fields, entities formed by the stillness of collapsed timelines. They had watched the galaxy fall into silence over eons, and in that silence they had thrived. Now the fire had returned, and it was burning through time. And they came to smother it. Their ships did not radiate, they removed light. Their weapons did not fire, they unmade probability. Where they passed, evolution recoiled, planets ceased to spin. Memory peeled away from species like skin from bone. They spoke once. We were the first silence, you are the last defiance. The Ember worlds mobilized. But their weapons were stories, their defenses choice, their strategy mutation. No fleet could resist the extinguishers directly. Each engagement saw firefronts shredded, cities turned into anti-thought, but Elara had taught the galaxy not how to fight. How to adapt. At the Battle of Senska, where 10 million were extinguished in a heartbeat, a single survivor carried a thought form encoded in pain. That form became a new defense system, a mirror field that reflected extinction probabilities back on their source. At the ashing of Verax, the Sparkborn refused to run. Instead, they detonated their own planet, not to die but to become radiant debris, coalescing in orbit into a new consciousness, the Grief Core. Its song was so mournful, it melted 3 extinguisher nodes before vanishing into the sear line. The fire learned. And Elara had not stopped burning. She no longer needed a ship. She was the path, a living vector of ignition. Wherever she appeared, the laws bent, the silence cracked. She no longer fought as a general or even as a being. She fought as an event, the conflagration principle, a trigger in the hearts of others. One moment she burned in the skies over Hollow Shrine V, reigniting the planetary mindscape of the fallen Silexian race. The next, she existed only as a whisper, passed between dying warriors on a frozen moon as they chose to ignite rather than submit. The fire was no longer hers alone. It had spread beyond her. And that was the point. At the threshold of the galactic abyss, where light refused to pass and even probability frayed, the final confrontation unfolded. The extinguishers arrived in unity, a mass of conceptual darkness, larger than galaxies, older than light. They issued their verdict. Return to entropy, fire is error. Elara answered not in defiance. In invitation. Burn with us. She opened herself not as a weapon but as a memory of life choosing growth, of pain transforming into purpose, of children lighting their first sparks under forgotten skies, of species that had chosen change again and again despite everything. The extinguishers touched the memory. And for the first time they wavered. For the first time they remembered what they had once fled. They were not born of silence. They had been burned once too. Elara did not destroy them. She relit them. And in that moment, even the darkness became part of the flame. The galaxy did not end in fire. It began with it. No longer ruled, no longer static, a spiral of flickering possibilities of worlds born not in isolation but in shared ignition. The stars no longer hung cold and distant. They sang, burning with intention. And across them moved 1,000 kinds of life, shaped by fire, bound not by fear, but by the knowledge that transformation was not death. It was living. And at the center of it all, deep within the pulse of the sear line, Elara burned. Not alone. With all of them. The stars would never forget again.